Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, this is Ray Gerard. Welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. This is the program that imagines, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if, looking at what is happening in our country today, he could write a letter to America? What would he tell us? Well, here on this program, we give you precisely such a letter. We then utilize that letter for an in-depth discussion of an issue that is current in our lives and our society today. We look at it through the eyes of St. Paul. Often, we talk about two things that people say never to talk about at the same time: religion and politics. Why? Because religion is not something that can be limited to 60 minutes on a Sunday morning, because the religion based on Christ, contains the truth. And the truth cannot be anything but necessary when considering the affairs of people in our society and in community. And as we discuss these matters, we always bear a motto in mind: love and kindness through the light of truth. Hopefully that is what we do here today. Now, for our program, our subject is a new law that is being proposed in the Congress called the Do No Harm Act. And as I think about this particular law, what occurs to me is that there's a fear of freedom in our country today. A fear of freedom. We are afraid to let people think the way they want to think or express themselves they want to express themselves when it comes to religion and when it comes to God. Why this this negativity towards God? We're going to explore that a little bit today. But first, let's talk about what this particular law is. It is a law that takes away a religious exemption in our current laws for claims of discrimination. If someone says that they're acting out of a religious belief, that if they're doing something that might be considered discriminatory, but that they are doing it out of a strong religious conviction, then they're allowed basically some leniency. This new law seeks to take that away. It seeks to control everybody so that everybody must follow the same rules. It seeks to, in effect, control our beliefs about certain things. And it is a difficult question. For example, there is, of course, the famous case of the Masterpiece Cake Shop, who said that they did not want to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. And they were promptly sued. They were penalized by a regulatory commission in the state of Colorado. A lawsuit followed, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court found in favor of the cake shop, and then that same cake shop then has been subjected to 2 more lawsuits, a third one just very recently being filed. People will not let them alone. Why? Why this passion for going after this particular cake shop? Surely these people could get a wedding cake from somebody else. It would, I believe, if I recall the case correctly, that the cake shop people even were willing to recommend, other bakers who could do a wedding cake for these people. So why? Why go after these people over and over and over again? Is it a fear to let them be how they want to be, that we all need to play by the same rules? We all need to accept the same moral principles. We all need to have the same religious beliefs, in a sense, when those religious beliefs find their way into moral principles. So this is what this particular law is aimed at. There is And it is, like I said, a touchy question. Where do we draw the line between doing something out of your own religious beliefs, doing something that you feel compelled to do out of your own personal religious convictions, and when does that cross the line where it harms society, where society as a whole can't allow it because it would do harm to other people? Hence the title of the new law, the Do No Harm Act. It basically draws this dividing line and says, if you offend some other person, if you would consider discriminatory towards another person, then you are violating the law. Now, this dividing line was considered by St. Paul. And if he were here today, I submit he might write the following letter. All things are permitted, but all things are not beneficial. All things are permitted, but all things do not build up. No one should do things for his own advantage, but that of his neighbor. Perform services for others without raising questions on grounds of conscience, for all people are beloved by God. If an unbeliever asks you to bake a cake, bake whatever cake he or she asks, without raising questions on grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, this cake is for a same-sex wedding, do not bake it, on account of the one who called attention to it, and on account of conscience. I mean, not your own conscience, but the others. But why should my freedom be determined by someone else's conscience? If I bake cakes or do work for others in service to God, why should I be reviled for what I do? Whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Avoid giving offense whether to same-sex couples, unbelievers, or the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in every way, not seeking my own benefit, but that of the many, that they may be saved. Now, as you might have guessed, St. Paul did not actually write that letter. He wrote one very similar, however. He wrote it to the Corinthians. It was in his. This is just a modest modification of what you would find in chapter 10 in his first letter to the Corinthians. Now, there, what he was talking was not so much about preparing food, but it was about consuming food. And he basically took the position, look, all things are permitted. You can go ahead and eat any food you want, but everything is not necessarily beneficial. Still, if it doesn't. Also, basically, what he was saying is, look, if someone says to you, "Here's some food, go ahead and eat it," despite the strictures in the Mosaic law at the time about what food you can eat and cannot eat, go ahead and you can eat anything you want. That's fine. Well, what happens if? Because if you eat things with a thankfulness to God, if you have this, Spirit of God within you, then don't be concerned. You need not be concerned so much about detailed laws. That the primary thing is to be mindful of the Spirit of God, to be thankful to God, and if you do that, then you are following Christ. But he said, however, if, and this would apply even if, for example, you are given food that has been part of a sacrifice to an idol, then you would be participating in idolatry if you eat that food. He said, however, that to be considerate to others, to do, not to refuse food to other people, refuse food offered by other people, even in this context. Even then, even though you might otherwise not want to do it, trying to be kind to everybody, trying to do good for everybody else, go ahead, eat that food. Why should I be reviled if I do this out of kindness to other people? However, if someone says, that this food was part of a sacrifice to idols, and they draw attention to it, he said at the time, then do not eat it. And do not eat it as a matter of conscience, not your own conscience. Now, mind you, the problem is posed because someone's offering you food that would be supportive, that if you partake of it, it would be supportive of idolatry, and you might have qualms about that. But that when this fact is made known, then it's not your conscience that would prevent you from eating it, but that it would be the other person's conscience. Then you would not partake of it, because then they've called attention to it. And then you do have to make a stand. And then what you are trying to do is for the sake of others, that they may be saved. So in this difficult ethical situation at the time, this was something that was very important to the people of the Middle East and the Jewish community and people of his time. This was very important, what food you could eat and couldn't eat. And there is, there could be intense debate about it, and Paul could suffer a great deal of criticism. Eating food given to you by an unbeliever, food that was not strictly in accordance with Mosaic law, just simply to eat that, it was very controversial. But trying to give no offense to everybody else, trying to do good to everybody, trying to live with the Spirit, Paul took the side of those on this controversial question who would say, go ahead and eat. He did draw a dividing line, however. And when the person offering the food told you that, look, this food is, partaking of this food would give recognition to this particular idol that I worship, then you can't do it anymore. But again, the focus is not so much on you, it's on the other person, to try to instruct them, to try to show them the light, to try to share with them the good news, the blessings that Paul was now aware of through Christ. That was the important thing. The other person was the important thing. So, in our context in America today, would that particular letter have relevance? Well, I submit that it could very easily take the form of the letter that we submitted at the beginning here, where if you were asked to bake a cake, sure, go ahead, bake a cake. If you're asked to do other things for other people, sure, go ahead and do it. Don't let it trouble your conscience. However, if you become aware that it is for something that is against your religious principles, and if you go ahead and do it anyway, it would make a public show of the fact that you do not hold those principles dear, then you can't do it. If we believe, remember now, Paul always thought that belief, that faith was not just simply a matter of saying certain words or having certain principles or holding certain principles in your mind or rationally agreeing with certain things, but belief and faith was only real, it was only true, it was only authentic if you acted it out. Because if your actions did not match your beliefs, then you really don't believe. If you believe there is a God, if you believe that he regards certain things as sinful, then you cannot act contrary to that. That is how Paul approached this delicate ethical question. Now, here in the United States today, our Congress has taken a different approach, where they draw the line on a controversial issues such as making a cake for a same-sex couple or something of that, or whether or not an employer should pay for contraception or abortifacients for their employees. The Congress, at least certain members of Congress, believe that line should be drawn not down the middle, but all the way to one side. that if you offend somebody, then your religious principles have to take a back seat. So we are in effect declaring winners and losers in this proposition, are we not? Go back to this Masterpiece Cake Shop example. These people that wanted the cake could go to another baker and get their cake. Why is it necessary for this particular bake shop to bake that cake? Are we not declaring winners and losers? Why not simply let people be free? Freedom. That is and has been the cornerstone of this country, and there are attacks on it. And these attacks are dangerous. Why do people, and people often act this way out of fear. Why do people fear letting other people be free? Why is there some need to try to control how they might act or what they might think? Because that is, in fact, what we're talking about. They really want efforts like this, efforts to force this cake shop person to act a certain way, are really efforts to control thought, either of that particular baker or everybody that hears the news story about it. And that is embodied in this new legislative proposal. Now, back in the 1990s, Congress was of a different mindset. The Congress passed something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Why? There was a lawsuit. There was a Native American Indian, and he had been fired from a governmental job. He had partaken in a religious ritual in which he smoked or ate what was called peyote, and I guess it caused him to test positive for a certain banned substance, a certain drug of some sort. And so he was fired from his job. And he claimed that, look, I was doing this simply in accordance with my religious beliefs. It was something I was required to do, and so I shouldn't be penalized for it. The case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court said, you are out of luck. It is too bad you have lost your job. Get used to it. Well, in response, the Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA. And RFRA said, not that, if you do something out of a religious belief, you're allowed to do it. No, it just simply said there would be a test that would be applied. That if the government wanted you to do something, they wanted you to perform some act or not perform some act, whatever, if they wanted to control your behavior, and you said, I disagree, I cannot do as you wish because I have a religious belief to the contrary, the government could still force you to comply if, number one, the government had a compelling state interest. It was not simply because the government wanted to, but if it was important to the functioning of government, if it was important to the welfare of society as a whole, if there was a compelling need from the government's point of view for you to do this, that would be part one of the test. Another part would be whether or not the government chose the least onerous or burdensome method to make you comply. They'd have to try to accommodate your religious beliefs as much as possible. And if the government passed both of those tests, then you could be forced to comply. But there's a balancing act. There was a weighing of factors that would take place. It was not a law that said you automatically win if you claim religion as your defense. Well, this new law that's being proposed, called the Do No Harm Act, it's always interesting how they come up with certain euphemisms like the pro-choice movement. That's a nice way to phrase it, but it's a choice only for one person. It's only for the mother. Obviously, the unborn child gets no choice in this. And in many states, the fathers or even the parents don't have a say in making the choice either. But that's a question for another day. But anyways, it's called the Do No Harm Act. And it focuses on one side of the parties involved in a case like Masterpiece Cake. And that is that if somebody feels they're discriminated against, then you're not allowed an exemption. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the balancing act, the test the test does not apply. Listen to that. The test. No. What is wrong with applying a test? If someone claims, look, I have a deep religious belief about this. If I have to make a cake for somebody else and it's a same-sex wedding and I'm condoning that same-sex wedding, if I'm publicly denying my faith, I'm denying God. I'm violating one of the Ten Commandments. I'm committing a sin. It could harm my immortal soul. I mean, these are things that could carry the gravest weight for a person depending on the depth of their religious beliefs. And if someone says, my religious belief is very deep and this is very important to me, can the government just come in and say, too bad? Or should the government not have to say, well, we understand, however, it's very important for us in this case, and I'll tell you why. This new law, the Do No Harm Act, says the government does not even have to do that. The exemption under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act simply doesn't apply. Why would people want to do this? Why would people want to do this? This new law, oh, by the way, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, back in the 1990s, was overwhelmingly adopted by the Congress. It was passed in the House of Representatives unanimously. Now listen to that, unanimously. When have you ever heard, when can you recall, when have you ever heard of anything being passed by the House of Representatives unanimously? Nowadays, Democrats and Republicans agree on nothing. Votes go often directly down party lines. This was a unanimous vote in the House of Representatives. And in the U.S. Senate, it was 97-3. And the law was promptly signed by President Bill Clinton. So how have we gone so far so fast? In 20 years, now 25 years, we have gone, at least in the minds of these people in the House of Representatives that are trying to pass this new law, we've gone so far in the other direction. What is wrong with religious freedom at least being allowed a test? Well, this bill was proposed, the Do No Harm Act was proposed by a representative, a member of Congress by the name of Kennedy. And he basically said that, we cannot have freedom here in America if we go ahead and, here's his exact quote. We cannot be equal or free if our government grants select Americans a license to discriminate against their neighbors under the guise of religious freedom. He said that we can reestablish the sacred balance between religious liberty and personal liberties of those who have too often had their civil rights bargained away. It's interesting. He talks about the sacred balance between religious liberty and the personal liberties or the civil rights of others. Since does this test, this constitutional test that I just outlined with compelling state interests, compelling governmental interests, and the least burdensome measures, this constitutional test, this legal test, when did that become sacred? And why is there a need to call it sacred? Are we imposing a new type of religion, one of the government, one of the state, and one that is not tied to God? What is sacred about governmental rules and legal principles and tests? Mr. Kennedy says that we cannot be equal if our government grants Americans a license to discriminate against others. So we cannot be equal if we allow certain people religious freedom. That's what we're talking about, just the freedom to express their religion. It is not, as I said, an absolute guarantee that they get to do what they want. They simply get the right to claim in court that by weighing the various factors, the importance of religion to the individual versus the importance to the government of making somebody comply, that's how that is a basic right. I mean, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall make no law that either establishes religion or prevents the free exercise thereof. This is something that is enshrined in our Constitution. But now, we cannot be equal, and isn't that in fact what they want to do? They want everybody to be equal. In a word, think alike. Think alike how? With the new state religion, with these sacred principles of non-discrimination, these sacred governmental rules. So we cannot be, if we allow other people the chance to have religious freedom, it's interesting and disturbing. A similar piece of legislation is being proposed and being forwarded in the U.S. Senate by Senator Kamala Harris. And she said the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution should not come at the expense of others. Well, remember now, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution talks about religious freedom. It also talks about freedom of speech. And if she's correct that the things that are guaranteed by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution should not come at the expense of others, then we practically will have no free speech at all. It is always possible that an exercise of free speech can offend somebody. People have the right to burn the American flag. That certainly might offend a lot of people. Anybody who's served in the armed services of this country may be deeply offended by that. People who put their lives on the line to defend that flag could be deeply offended by somebody burning it. But we still allow people to burn that flag. Why? Because part of what that flag represents is the freedom to speak as you wish. If you want to criticize this country, you can do that. That has been the hallmark of this country. That has been what's distinguished us from totalitarian states. And just, whenever and wherever you want to think about, just look at China today and Tiananmen Square. I mean, if you think there's the ability to criticize that government, then you need to look again. That has been why people have admired this country. That has been why people have wanted to immigrate to this country. That has been our hallmark, this freedom of speech. And what kind of speech can be more important than the freedom to express yourself on religion? In the First Amendment, actually the right to religious freedom is mentioned before the right to freedom of speech, as if perhaps it was thought to be more important. It was first in the list of things being mentioned in that amendment. So if we are going to subjugate that so that it is not allowed, if it has to come at the expense of others, then we may never have it at all. What others are we talking about? What others get to control the question? What happens if expressing my religious beliefs comes at the expense of somebody else who is an atheist? But I'm not allowed. I may not, so effectively, I might not be allowed to have religious freedom at all. I mean, that is the logical direction of where these things are going. So this is certainly a trend. This is a trend that is continuing. People want to effectuate this more and more these days. And the question, of course, is why? I mean, there is at the forefront of a lot of these cases that are being brought. There's, for example, a recent case that was decided in a way in a little town called Hawkins, Texas. Just as another example of people trying to quell religious freedom, there's this little town in Texas called Hawkins, and it is a town of only 1,300 residents. And for 4 years, they have been fighting a legal battle over a sign that says, Jesus welcomes you to Hawkins. Now, this particular sign sits on property that was purchased from some funeral homes. It was private property. The sign, I believe, was originally made by some governmental workers, but it was purchased. I believe that the sign and the property, it's private. But nonetheless, an organization called the Freedom from Religion Foundation, a little group up in Wisconsin, wrote a letter to the mayor of Hawkins and said, you have to take this sign down. And you can't have this particular sign. This promotes religion. And in this country, under the First Amendment of the Constitution, as then applied to state and local governments through the 14th Amendment, you cannot, as a governmental authority, promote a certain religion. So Jesus welcomes you, that sign has to come down. Well, a private foundation, as I say, a religious foundation bought this particular property. They fought over it. I think the town claimed that, well, there was an easement or a road that was going to go through there, so they had no right to sell it. And so they really didn't have the right to do what they did. Don't really know, not familiar with the details of the particular lawsuit, but they fought it over 4 years. This was all started from a letter from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And the town of Hawkins then decided to try to avoid a lawsuit. They had to try to take this sign down. And what, of course, happened was, 4 years of a lawsuit. But nonetheless, that's what happened. Well, recently, the employees from the town of Hawkins, municipal employees, went and physically took this sign down. The people who owned the private property wrote a letter to the town saying, "Do not touch that sign." They took it down anyways, and they forcibly removed it. And this came about as a result of a simple letter 4 years ago from this group up in Wisconsin, a group all the way up in Wisconsin, worried about what happens in a little town of 1,300 people and a little sign all the way down in Texas. Why? Why do people go to such lengths to inject themselves into the affairs of others? I remember Senator Harris said, we can't allow religious freedom if it's going to come at the expense of others. Well, why does a group up in Wisconsin get to inject itself in the affairs of some people all the way down in Texas? Nevertheless, that's what goes on in our country today. And to look a little bit at this organization called the Freedom from Religion Foundation, it was interesting to me. I found a recent article written by somebody on their website. It was all about Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which is about climate change and the need to protect the environment. And while initially praiseworthy of the Pope's feelings in this regard, she just dismissed it or downplayed it because she said that was about the best that we could hope for from a Pope. Nevertheless, she went on and talked about the church in general. And she said, I do have a major quarrel to pick with Pope Francis and his encyclical, which is that since that dastardly Humanae Vitae was issued in 1968, in which Pope Paul VI not only crushed the hopes of an entire generation of idealistic young Catholics, consigned women to be brood mares, and cemented the Church's war on abortion and contraception, the world population went from 3.5 billion to today's 7.3 billion. And that, she says, is a crime by humanity against what the Pope calls Sister Earth. So even though the Pope is in favor of taking steps to combat climate change. She thinks it's perhaps too little, too late. That the primary fault for this lies with the Catholic Church. That a lot of our climate change issues occur because the world population has gone from 3.5 billion to over 7 billion. That it's more than doubled, and that our climate change problem would be a lot less if we had a lot less people. And she makes no bones about the fact that she holds the church responsible for world population. She says, sure, there are other religions and factors at fault, but I hold the Catholic hierarchy most to blame for humanity's out-of-control population growth. Now, isn't that interesting? The church still maintains the contraception is not proper, that it's against the will of God, that to deny life when God would otherwise grant life is in fact sinful, because it is denying God. It is turning your back on God. And of course, abortion, another method of population control. And the church takes stances against both those things. Nevertheless, we are often confronted by polls that the media tells us most Catholics favor contraception or things of that nature. So, and of course, how much of the world population is made up by Catholics? If Catholics make up 1.2 billion people, if the world's population is 7.3 and growing, how is the Catholic Church, if most of the people in the church are not even abiding by its principle on contraception? If, I don't know, 10%, maybe 120 million out of that 1.2 billion, if those are the faithful Catholics that are abiding by it, but nevertheless the world population is 7 billion, but the Catholic hierarchy is primarily responsible. But this is what she says. She says, most despicable is the Pope's recent strong affirmation of the Church's condemnation on what it insists on calling artificial birth control, contraception. So the Church is dastardly. It is despicable. She talks about the irrational doctrines of the Catholic Church and the fact that the Church insists on maternal sacrifice. She's talking about abortion now. She talks about, if there's a choice, the Church still counsels, let the pregnant woman die, save the fetus. She continues by talking about when Pope Paul II made a trip to the U.S. in 1987. She goes all the way back to 1987 and is still bothered by what she calls Pope mania that was present at the time. And she resurrected, pardon that pun, but she brought back to mind a song that apparently this foundation, or someone at this foundation had written back then, the Stay Away Pope polka. The world is overcrowded and they're dying of starvation. And you tell them what they need is a prayer? A simple word from you could help control the population, but no, you're too religious to care. There is an animosity, an antipathy, a vehemence against the Catholic Church. It stands for certain principles. It says and dares to say publicly certain things are wrong. Contraception is wrong. Same-sex marriages are wrong. Abortion is wrong. When many other institutions and authorities and people with a public voice are all going in one direction, the Church stands strong and stalwartly saying no. What is important is what God wants, not what we want. And if God wants abortion, as Madonna, the singer Madonna seems to think, if God wants birth control, if God wants same-sex unions, contrary to what is said over and over in the Bible, then all well and good. But if he doesn't, then we can't go along with it. The emphasis, the focus always has to be what does God want? People don't ask that question anymore. We're content with, what do we want? What do I think? The church cannot divorce itself from God. As long as it believes that God thinks certain things, then that's what it will follow. And that's what certain people call dastardly. It's troubling. It's troubling. And that's why some people, and perhaps it is out of fear that people want to control our religious freedom. When the church takes these stances that these things are wrong, people don't want to hear it. They want birth control. They want same-sex unions or transgenderism. Oh, by the way, there's a third lawsuit filed against Masterpiece Cake Shop just recently. It's a transgender, has a transgender basis. So it's again, people want to attack this little baker because he's standing up for what he believes and will not back down. The church stands up for what it believes. It will not back down, and it suffers attacks by certain people. And part of that obviously has to be, part of the reason for that obviously has to be, they don't want to hear what these people have to say. If more and more people, if these people get a chance to speak, if the church and the owner of this cake shop gets a chance to speak, then other people may listen to them. And if other people may listen to them, then it may seem like what they want, what they're doing is wrong. And can't have that. So we have to control other people. Now, Paul said in the letter which we started with today, that if you are caught in a situation where you're called to choose between doing a kindness, giving no offense to other people, trying to welcome and appreciate everybody else all the time, and in certain cases you're caught between doing that and standing up for a religious principle, standing up for your belief in God, standing so that you do not deny God, then you have to side with God. You have to tell people the truth. And that's what's bothersome to many. They don't want to hear other people speak the truth. Now, in this country, it was always a matter of, just having freedom of speech. You speak what you want, I speak what I want. We both get to think about it. Maybe we agree to disagree. But that is what should be allowed. The efforts on attacking freedom of religion, freedom of speech, there's lots of stories about that on college campuses, for example. But in any event, these are attacks on freedom. They're attacks on people exercising their free will. And people are even speculating now as to whether or not we even have free will. And of course, what's at the heart of that? Well, if we don't really have free will, then we can't really attack it. These efforts to control us are much more palatable, much less blameworthy. In psychology today, for example, it's openly questioned. Well, do humans have the ability to make their own choices and make their own fates? It's still not clear. This entry that can be found in Psychology Today talks about, it's still not clear whether or not humans actually have free will. It may be, however, more healthy to think they have it. There are some recent interesting tests and studies that have been done on this subject. Now, before, about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, psychology was just coming to the forefront. And like Sigmund Freud were explaining behaviors based on things that happened decades in a person's past. And therefore, what they did was not really their fault. And the legal defense came about. Well, it didn't really come about from that, but nevertheless, a host of different takes on the defense of not being responsible for one's actions because someone was not of a right mind. the varieties of that, of those claims, those defensive claims, proliferated. But it was psychology that was suggesting that people were not necessarily responsible, and in certain cases, in many cases perhaps, for what they did. Now it's neuroscience. The contemporary scientific image of human behavior, reading from an article in The Atlantic. There's no such thing as free will. An article written by Stephen Cave back in 2016. He says the contemporary scientific image of human behavior is one of neurons firing, causing other neurons to fire, causing our thoughts and deeds in an unbroken chain that stretches back to our birth and beyond. In principle, we are therefore completely predictable. One of the seminal tests that was done in this area was done back in the 1980s by a physiologist named Benjamin Libet. And he demonstrated that, he didn't demonstrate this, but it was known that electrical activity builds up in a person's brain before, for example, someone takes the physical act of moving his or her hand. But Libet showed that this electrical buildup occurs in the brain before the person consciously makes a decision to move. I don't know if it builds up in the brain, but the electrical activity builds up before the conscious decision to make the hand move. In other words, our actions determine before we even decide to take them. There was a couple of professors, Kathleen Vos from University of Utah, Jonathan Schooler, University of Pittsburgh, and investigating and exploring this whole question of free will, they asked a group of participants to read a passage which argued that free will was an illusion. And then they asked another group to read a passage that was neutral. It wasn't in favor of free will, it was just simply neutral on the topic. Then they put the members to a couple of different tests. For example, they had them participate in a math test where cheating was made easy and people could easily take a peek at the answer. And those people who had previously just read this passage that, made the argument free will was not real, they were more prone to cheat on that math test. Another experiment on whether or not people would be more prone to steal. They were more prone to steal. And why? Because if there's no free will, people stop seeing themselves as blameworthy. Feeling guilt is something that can restrain you from doing certain things. There's another researcher, Roy Baumeister, Florida State University, and in his experience, he found that a weaker belief in free will produced the following. For example, people were less likely to help a classmate, less likely to give money to a homeless person, less committed to relationship. They had a lower feeling of the meaningfulness of life. They were less creative, less likely or less willing to learn. Their academic performance was lower. They were less grateful towards one another. The list goes on and on. Free will produces a host, or it's connected with a host of what we would consider good outcomes. Any attacks on our freedoms are attacks on our free will. But now it's openly thought that maybe we don't have free will. Neuroscience, we form these, when we're young, we start forming these patterns of neural connections in our brain, and then one connection produces another connection, one network another. And by the time we get, to be several decades of age, everything's determined. Everything's determined. All our actions are determined. We really don't have free will. It's just simply an illusion. Men like Sam Harris think that, it's important. Well, certain people think that free will is an illusion, but it's important to let people think that it exists because it produces all these good results. Samuel Harris a noted atheist, doesn't think so. He thinks, no, it's important for us to understand what really controls us, what really determines our actions, so that we can then better craft and manage those stimuli. So let me understand this. We're basically all machines, with our actions being predetermined in certain ways. And now if we simply change the stimulus, then we can change our actions, and we can create a more ordered society. How Orwellian. How bleak and drab a human existence is this? We look at humans as machines. We're going to change the stimuli so that we achieve and obtain better performing machines. The word dehumanization doesn't even begin to describe the problems with this. Now, all this presumes that we can't decide things for ourselves, that we really don't have a free will. There was a spiritual renewal program that I participated in recently with about 9 other men, and it was called Exodus 90. And it was all about changing patterns of behavior. And it was called Exodus 90 because the activity had to go on for 90 days. Why? Because if you did something for 90 days, that could change a habit. Well, wait a minute. I thought my neural networks were already fixed and established. How can I change them? When I decide to participate in Exodus 90, am I doing that? Is there something that happened in my previous past, my set of neural networks that had already been formed that caused me to participate in Exodus 90, that caused me then to change my habits? About, for example, eating between meals, or, devoting a certain amount of time to God in prayer every day. There are certain habits, doing a nightly examine. I mean, these are some of the habits that Exodus 90 tried to cultivate. So, was this all predetermined that I would do this? This is a scary type of thinking, because if this holds sway, I mean, you've got people writing in Psychology Today. You've got major thinkers and scholars questioning whether or not, openly questioning and thinking that we don't have free will. Maybe consigning themselves to the admission that, well, it's probably good if we let people, think they have free will, but we really don't. Once we go down that road, what kind of a Pandora's box do we open? Well, we open up a Pandora's box where we have things like the Do No Harm Act. We need to control people. If we have a lower belief in free will, and then we have a higher propensity to cheat on math tests, to steal money, to do these types of things. If we have a lower, respect for free will, then we're allowed to do things without blame. Well, then we're also allowed to trample on people's freedom. We can force people to make cakes, in which, in one way, in a certain sense, they're denying their own God. And we don't have to feel blame about that. We don't really have free will anyway. But we're doing it. I don't know how you come up with the decision to go ahead and pass a Do No Harm Act and make other people conform to your ideas about things if your ideas are not really your own anyway. It becomes a confusing vortex where people get divorced from responsibility from their own actions. And we don't have to feel blame for forcing other people to do certain things, because we're creating a better ordered state, a better ordered group of human machines. These things are tied together. These things don't happen in a vacuum. We may talk about discrimination. We may talk about the Do No Harm Act being simply a way to reduce or mitigate harmful discrimination against other people. But what we're really talking about is taking away people's freedom. What we're really talking about is curbing and controlling and limiting their free will, their ability to decide for themselves what they choose to believe and what they don't. And we don't have to feel bad about it because we really don't have any free will anyways. These things are connected, and they are certainly off the mark. They're certainly they are actions that lead us down an improper road because they are divorced from God. St. Paul said, even if it seems like it's unkind, even if it seems like you're being critical of another person, if necessary to stand up for God, then you have to stand up for God. When people say there is no free will, when people say we can curtail the freedoms of other people, especially when they're talking about their beliefs, then we are going down the wrong road. We are denying God, because God is the one who has given us free will. It is a gift from Him. We would have nothing without Him. We certainly wouldn't have free will without Him. To deny it, to deny the use of it to other people, is to deny Him. Certain people want to maintain their ability to say otherwise. They want to maintain their freedom of religion. It is a fight in this country. If St. Paul were to write a letter to us, he would tell us it is a fight worth fighting. He certainly ran a long, hard race and fought a good fight to stand up for things even as it cost him his life. He would certainly be telling us not to deny our God. Well, this has been another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. We hope that it has been informative in some of the things going on in our country and our society today that you might not otherwise have known about. We hope that it's helped stir some reflections on these matters that perhaps you might not otherwise have had. But we thank you for the opportunity to do this, and we hope you will join us again. Until then, God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.